I'd like to present Nina Paulovicova, PhD, Associate Professor at History Center for Humanities at Athabasca University, Canada. So her report will be devoted to the far right's mnemonic alliance with Putin's Russia. The ĽSNS mastering of a disruptive past. So, Dr. Paulovicova.
Thank you so much, Konstantin, for your introduction, and thank you to organizers for inviting me to this critical conference. I apologize I couldn't attend earlier sessions because we have 8 hours early, so I just woke up an hour ago. There is a time difference. So yes, as Konstantin mentioned, the name of my talk is the Far Right's Mnemonic Alliance with Putin's Russia, ĽSNS's Mastering of a Disruptive Past. So the main objective of this study, which I co-authored with Olga Derfashova, a colleague from Bratislava, is basically to scrutinize the mechanics of Far-Right People's Party of our Slovakia, which I will abbreviate for as a ĽSNS because it's a long title. And I will talk about its memory construction of a transnational alliance with Putin's Russia. So basically the talk will be about how far-right ĽSNS utilizes past events such as Slovak National Uprising and 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet troops to establish a memory alliance with Putin's Russia. Before we delve deeper into how ĽSNS is proceeding with this mnemonic alliance, I would like to share a few words about ĽSNS and its ideology. So ĽSNS is a Slovak far-right party under the leadership of Marian Kotleba, whom you see in the picture. And the party marked its height in 2016 when the party made it to parliament. However, 5 years later, in 2021, ĽSNS split due to internal struggle, and 2023 elections confirmed its loss of influence. ĽSNS scored only 0.84% votes. But even if ĽSNS is electorally weak, its memory politics seem to have a considerable impact on the views of Slovaks who were described by Globsex in 2021 as bear huggers, due to the considerable reach of pro-Russian sentiments in society. In order to unpack how far-right ĽSNS facilitates a transnational memory alliance with Putin's Russia, we focus on these two historical events, Slovak National Uprising and 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, and we looked at how ĽSNS manipulates the memory of these two events to achieve a transnational mnemonic alliance with Putin's Russia. So it's interesting to see how you can bridge the Russia's so-called anti-fascist heritage and ĽSNS's fascist far-right ideology. So theoretically speaking, our study builds on scholarship tackling transnational memory alliances. In particular, we move away from the notion of competitive memory and apply Michael Rosberg's multidirectional memory as a process of ongoing negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing, which is productive and not privative. So this was the definition of Michael Rosberg's multidirectional memory. So in so doing, we argue that ĽSNS's memory construction is multidirectional rather than competitive or discordant. So what this means, Michael Rosberg's multidirectional memory concept was inspired by Sigmund Freud's screen memory. And this, so in so doing, screen memory covers up traumatic event, right? And it is covering traumatic event that cannot be approached directly. In so doing, it suppresses the original experience with a specific mnemic image, which screens out the trauma or objectionable aspects of the original experience. So without going into these more complex theoretical details, I would like to share with you why exactly we decided to choose 1944 and 1968 as two critical memories to study these alliances. So we, I think I skipped one. No, I didn't. Okay, I'm okay. So we selected these two events because they respectively, their histories were determined by direct encounters between the Soviet Union and Slovak historical actors, of course. The 1944 and 1968 events are at the core of the dominant mnemonic culture and identity politics in Slovakia. In other words, they are very important in our history. The collective memories of 1944 and 1968 operate intergenerationally, inter-imperially, and transnationally. So they are not only locked nationally, there is a broader outreach of these memories. And another important point is that nature of 1944 and 1968 Slovak-Soviet historical interactions differed substantially. So while the official interpretation of 1944 Slovak national uprising, the history of which was entangled with the help, planning, and assistance of Soviet partisans, represents the cornerstones of Slovak identity, the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact troops under the command of Soviets is condemned as an act of aggression. And just to illustrate how they are perceived in Slovak society, there is a graph on your right side on the slide. And the first event that I circled is Slovak national uprising. And the blue color indicates the positive response of Slovaks to this event. And if you look at the bottom of the graph, there is the 1968 event. And the red color indicates the negative approach. Of course, it was invasion by the Soviet army and Warsaw Pact troops. So it's approached negatively, but the graph can give you also the amount of approval of these events and disapproval at the same time. So from the far-right ĽSNS's perspective, both of these events, 1944 and 1968, represent a challenge. It is an anomaly, or basically obstacle for their Russophilia and Panslavism. To understand how ĽSNS approximates this seemingly irreconcilable rift to solidify the mnemonic alliance, I will briefly provide the context behind the history and memory of each milestone. So, 1944 Slovak national uprising, as I mentioned, was very important milestone in Slovak history because it expressed Slovaks' determination to fight Nazism and fascism during the Slovak national uprising. Following the outbreak of the uprising, Soviet partisans joined Slovak partisans as both sides shared a common goal to defeat Nazi Germany. So the uprising opened the path to re-establishment of Czechoslovakia and offered Czechs and Slovaks a ticket to post-war camp of victors. Yet, the uprising was remembered differently across political spectrum. So during communism, Slovak national uprising represented the vector of solidarity with the international working class and the Soviet Union. Communists appropriated the memory of the uprising as a moral societal code, a means of self-legitimization, an affirmation of regime's historical role and heroism in the fight against fascism and Nazism. However, or quite contrary, the ethno-nationalists, radical and far-right supporters of Tiso's Slovak state, which was a vassal republic of Nazi Germany during the war, approached uprising as a betrayal of Slovak republics. So there is a very different commemoration by far-right. The ethno-nationalists condemned the uprising as a death blow to Slovak nationhood and denounced August 29, 1944 as a black day in the history of the Slovak nation. So far-right ĽSNS, which proudly celebrates the heritage of wartime Tiso's regime, condemns the uprising as a putsch against the Slovak nation, as a death blow to the first Slovak ethnic state. ĽSNS condemns the uprising as a black day in history and labels its participants as deserters and red murderers. That's what they claimed. So such mnemonic images produced by ĽSNS challenge official memory of the uprising and produce vectors of memory transition through manipulating emotions of ethno-national pride, fear, or anxiety with an aim to reconfigure this memory of the distant past. So how does ĽSNS do it? They use symbolic memory, such as placing a black flag in the window of a country office in Banská Bystrica on the day of the 71st anniversary of Slovak national uprising, which is the image on your left. There is a black flag you can see. Or on the right side, symbolically, ĽSNS was flying a dark green balloon with ĽSNS logo over Banská Bystrica, which is the center of the Slovak national uprising, as a sign of provocation during the celebrations. All of these ĽSNS symbolic acts aim to challenge the place of Slovak national uprising in national memory. But interestingly, while within the national context, ĽSNS resorts to attacks against Slovak national uprising, its approach to the uprising differs when this event is negotiated as a transnational lieu de mémoire, which ĽSNS utilizes for maintaining close ties with Putin's Russia. So in the past few years, ĽSNS strived to build a closer alliance with Russia by soothing ĽSNS's memory of 1944 uprising and Putin's World War II tropes through several strategies. So just like Putin, ĽSNS downplays the importance of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the responsibility of the Soviet Union for the outbreak of World War II, and shifts attention toward the Munich Agreement and the West's responsibility for that outbreak. Now, to build a closer alliance with Russia and to soothe the friction of the uprising in memory, ḻSNS resorted to symbolic gestures. They were hoisting the Russian flag from the window of Kotleba's office in Banská Bystrica, a town that was the center of Slovak national uprising, and it is the image on your left side on the slide. That represent one example of ḻSNS's conciliatory gesture toward Putin's Russia and its anti-fascist identity. Another example there is the subtle rather than direct silencing of certain facts and abstaining from histories that represent obstacles toward the conciliation of far-right ḻSNS and Putin's Russia, which allows certain degree of soothing conflicting memories and even a partial convergence of historical narratives. So even symbolic gestures, carefully implemented fact omissions and subtle silencing can have a major impact on the formation of mnemonic alliances and eventually actual alliances on the geopolitical scene. Now, let me share now a few words about 1968. As you know, this is a Prague spring of 1968, which marked the culmination of the liberalization of the communist control regime. The idea of socialism with a human face at the core of the reform wing program led by Alexander Dubček was aborted by a military invasion of 200,000 Warsaw-backed troops and 2,000 tanks directed by the Soviet army on August 21st. What followed, as you know, was years of normalization under the leadership of Gustav Husak, the rule of communist hardliners, the elimination of reformists from the party ranks, the end of reforms, censorship, small-scale show trials, arrests of intellectuals, and persecution. So how does ḻSNS commemorate, or what are its practices around 1968? There are very few occasions when ḻSNS representatives articulate or instrumentalize this period of national history. In 2000, so I'll provide some example. In 2018, which was 50th anniversary of 1968, ḻSNS was conspicuously silent about it. And instead of commemorative speech, Kotleba's ḻSNS, its leader, distributed leaflets accusing the Slovak government of servility towards the West as an existential threat and as a new aggressor. So basically, he juxtaposed Soviet aggressor now with a Western aggressor in order and marked West as a colonizer to create that interesting switch of the sides, to condense the past and present, to divert attention away from the fact that the Soviet Union, sent the troops, invaded Czechoslovakia, and point to present-day context of the Western influence. On the 51st anniversary, which is the second example I'm providing, they published a post, and this is the post. You can, or I can read it for you, but basically I can't read it for you because I have the images of your faces, so you can read it for yourself. But basically, this post was accompanied by iconic photo of a man with a bare chest standing against a tank in the center of Bratislava. And the text suggests the mnemic image of democratic world as a passive onlooker, which challenges the 1968 official memory. So the existential threat is embedded in hypermasculinized, stamping American military boots, which were, quote, no better than the Soviet ones. So in other words, the presence of American military boots 51 years after 1968 underscores the temporality of return of Western colonialism, which so-called boomerangs into semi-periphery. So there is another, this is another example of manipulation of the past with the present while you switch the sides, and that's how you, disseminate a different form of memory of 1968. So in conclusion, in this study, we dissected ĽSNS's mnemonic strategies to understand how ĽSNS builds mnemonic alliances with Putin in Russia via 1944 Slovak National Uprising and 1968 memory construction. We identified the presence of multi-directional mnemonic trajectories, facilitating the alliance of seemingly irreconcilable ideologies, the extreme right ĽSNS, and then Putin's Russia's heritage embedded in anti-fascism. This mnemonic alliance with Putin's Russia was achieved by implementing several mnemonic strategies. And as I've shown through these few examples, rather than replacing these memories, ĽSNS was condensing existing memories by multiple manipulations. So, we analyzed these manipulations in very theoretical detail in our chapter. So this is a rather very simplified look and overview of what we did. So in concluding sentence, these trajectories and their effects implied Putin's Russia as the only viable solution to the identified threat. And the identified threat for ĽSNS these days is coming from the West. So here, I don't know if I run out of time or not, I would stop here.
No, you have several minutes. If you want something to add. If not, thank you for your report. It was quite fascinating. So if somebody has a question, please write. And I would like to ask from everyone. I have several questions. The first is about to what extent these narratives are popular with ordinary people, and is it a dominant vision of history or not? And the second question is about direct involvement with Russian governmental structures. I mean that in 2010s, Russian embassy was very active in erecting or reconstructing monuments devoted to the Soviet soldiers at Slovakia, and actually it's the main idea for official Russians to promote that we liberated Slovakia from the Nazism and Slovak uprising. It's quite an important event for Russian historical policy, and it's quite strange that the main allies of Putin, political allies, current allies, stand against this particular memory that quite important. They do believe in the idea of liberation.
So are we answering questions now or after all the presentations?
No.
Okay.
I suppose now it's better to do it now. Yes.
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't sure how it is organized. Yes. So how popular are these interpretations? As I showed you the graph, the popularity, like how people are approaching Slovak national uprising in 1968. So the majority of the population would have very positive view about Slovak national uprising, and they support it. But there are, of course, based on the graph, about, I don't recall, between 30–40% would have different interpretation of Slovak national uprising, seeing it as a basically killer of the first Slovak state. So for them, it would be a big no. They would distance. So it depends if you're ethno-nationalist or pro-European. As you know, right now, our society is split. There are protests saying Slovakia is Europe. And then there are also these other views saying, okay, we need a multipolar world. We don't want the West to dominate. We have to be, sensible to the situation here rather than being colonized by the West. So there are these, it's really like a, I would say, a very bipolar view to extremes, and something in between, very nuanced opinions, they're quite rare. And with 1968, like there is still like, of course, most of the people see it as, okay, this was clearly aggression, no matter what you do. At some point, Putin apologized for 1968 in the past, but then there was this documentary saying, oh, wait, we invaded Czechoslovakia because there was interference from the West. So there was this documentary that caused the turmoil because Putin basically was saying, oh, that was the right move to do. Now, of course, there is the impact of World War II liberation, Soviet liberation. We should be thankful to Soviet army because of their, humongous losses, material, and of course, death of civilians, death of Soviet soldiers, and so on and so on. And this is something that far right in Slovakia is in line with. So I recall there were night wolves coming once upon a time in Slovakia, and all the far right, gathered and traveled with them, reminding people the role of the Soviets did in liberation. So there is that alliance, and if you translate it to contemporary politics, I have a hard time to talk about far right only, because our Prime Minister Robert Fico, when you look, I was just thinking about his policies. When you look at his approach and statement about European Union or NATO or Ukraine, it is pretty much aligned with what far right is saying. So right now it's hard really to say who is far right, who is not far right, because it's all quite blurred. Not quite sure if you followed. Fico attended CSAC, which is the abbreviation for Conservative Societies Association Conference. There was a major conference of conservative in the United States, and Fico was present there. And his argument was pretty much aligned with Trump's alignment. He approved of his MAGA statement, "Make America Great Again." He even compared himself to in alliance with Viktor Orban's policy, so that would be like close. So it's very, when you look at these politics, originally Robert Fico started as a social democrat, but when you look at his conservative statements, ethno-nationalism, let's say racism, Islamophobia, even his past effort, which suggested, oh, let's create residential schools for Roma. It's you know, there is a lot of overlap with what he was saying and far right. And hence it would be also interesting to push this study further and look at, okay, how the liberal stream now commemorates these events and how it differentiates from what the far right is saying. That's something we didn't study in this paper, but with what is happening right now, especially after Trump's presidency, which, as you know, is quite overwhelming, that would be really important study to do.
Yeah. Thank you. And we have one question more from Sergei Ehrlich from Moldova. He writes, one of the Polish journalists pointed out that former Hitler's ally Hungary and Slovakia are friends of Putin now. Does the Slovakian opposition reflect that coincidence?
Sorry, can you please repeat that question? I will read it in the chat. I'll try to. You don't see. I don't see.
You don't. Yes, it's in private message. One Polish journalist says that there were two former allies of Hitler, Hungary and Slovakia, and nowadays they are friends of Putin. And Sergei Ehrlich asks whether Slovakian opposition reflects this coincidence, whether it draws attention to it or not. That
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yes, I understand the question. Yes.
Yeah, in the past, yes, Slovakia during the World War II was a vassal state of Nazi Germany. So yeah, and what rescued us was the Slovak national uprising. That's how we managed to get into the camp of the victors, and that's how we managed to show, okay, we are not, you know, supporting the Nazis. But the question of collaboration of the Slovaks with Nazis and collaboration, you know, in persecution of Jews and deportation of the Jews, that's something that is actually my major area of study. I studied the Holocaust. So there is, of course, undeniable fact that, yes, Slovaks were on the side of the Nazi Germany. They deported close to 80,000 of Jews to death camps. And so there is this guilt that Slovakia had to deal with after the war for a very long, and especially after 1989. So now the geopolitical constellation is, as I've mentioned, half and half. You can't really, the society is not united in where do we belong. Fico himself, despite his statements about being, you know, he went to see Putin unexpectedly, had a discussion with him. Everybody in Slovakia was shocked that he did it. But when he came back, there was this crisis when the opposition was asking him, okay, what does it mean? Why did you go to talk to Putin? Do we still believe in, belong in European Union and NATO? And he said, yes, we still believe in the European Union and NATO, but, you know, we need to have this peace immediately, no fighting in Ukraine, no loss of life. So there was the idea that is quite, Fico's idea or speech quite aligned with what far-right Milan Uhrid was saying, that yes, Slovakia wants to be in EU and NATO, it is not leaving, but we need EU to be reformed. Otherwise, he would be like a troublemaker, similarly to Orban. They will try to like hijack European Union within or just reform it. And by the reform, they are mostly appealing to economic changes. So they don't want any like a major political control. They just need economic collaboration and cooperation. So it's a very pragmatic stance, I would say. And there is even a concept that might capture it nicely, this concept of pragmatic trans ideology. Bragioli and Makarichev suggested it in their study, which is basically saying, okay, you can have far right, or you can have somebody on the left or a liberal agreeing on something because of pragmatic situation that dictates it. So officially, yes, Fico confirmed, like we are in EU, in NATO, but at the same time, he is not closing the door to Putin. So it's not like we are in between right now. It looks like society is really not, in agreement, like where we should be or where we should go. And there is lots of fear by the liberals. That's why you see all of these protests. They don't trust Fico. They don't trust Fico when he says we are in EU, we are in NATO, because of his actual visit of Putin or discussions with him. So it's difficult to read, what is really happening in his head.
Yes, and does somebody from opposition try to portray Fico as a collaborator like Slovakian leader during the Second World War, to play in this historical metaphor?
Yeah, like there are, people from opposition, Šimečka, for example, Progressive Slovakia, they would portray him as an authoritarian. As there are currently major changes in Slovakia. There was a judicial reform. There is a replacement of people in cultural institutions who have to be aligned with Fico supporters. So there are major transitions happening. People are being fired from their posts because of their political views without any explanation. They just receive the notice, okay, you're gone. And these are mainly cultural institutions right now, but also, as I mentioned, judiciary. So there is a lot going on. And yes, there is a criticism that Fico is turning into an authoritarian figure, but it's not only Slovak, a case. Look at what is happening, in US, and that has it's like a feeding. We have to see it not nationally, but we have to see these links connected, because it's spilling effect. Just like my presentation was pointing to transnational connections. And actually that paper is a part of a bigger project. There was a special issue we recently published, and Per-Anders Rudling and Georgi Kasyanov, who presented earlier in this conference, like their presentations were part of this special issue. And we emphasize this spilling and impact. We really have to look out of that national shell and look how, the other impacts through memory or, actual geopolitical acts can have an impact on what is happening. So it's something like what I'm trying to say, situation in Slovakia should not be viewed as being disconnected from the outside. Slovakia is a nation of 5 million people. Tokyo has 8 million. Okay, so we are smaller than Tokyo. And with that small nation, it needs to be allied. And of course, we've experienced this in history. We faced dangers from, all sides. So the public is confused, and that's why you see that split over the memory, geopolitics, and there is lots of fear. People are in the streets because of insecurity. They just don't believe what Fico is saying. That's as simple as it is. Needless to say, Fico is not, there are plenty of corruption scandals attached to him and his party. So people have every single reason not to trust Fico.
Thank you very much. So I have a lot of questions more, but we have to move.
You can send me an email.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yes, actually, it's quite interesting report, especially concerning the nationalists and how they view history and how they view important events of Soviet time, and actually when you made your report on Slovakia, I tried to compare what happens in Hungary and to put this into the framework of the current policies. You know that Fico and Orban are friends of Putin, or not, maybe not real friends, but they're trying to get their own profit on this situation, on this war in Ukraine, but what they've been doing in internal historical politics, it's quite not the same that Russia welcomes you, and usually Russia's Putin is very strong towards Polish or German or French leaders when they are trying to speak, to provide historical narratives that contradict what Putin thinks. But he keeps silence on Orban, on the museum of occupation, for instance. It was a project of with Orban's party, for instance, in Hungary, in Budapest. But in Russia, nobody speaks about this. And it is quite important to understand to what extent Russian foreign policy needs history, and to what extent it may be much more flexible in this way. So